Enjoy.
In the video clip that we just saw, the one phrase that stood out most to me, I don't know for you, but was this sentence: he died alone. That sounds so hard, to die alone. But worse, many of us live alone. We're living isolated from the power and potential of community to strengthen us, to encourage us, to teach us. We don't begin this life with any standard of real perfection. We don't begin this life with all of the skills or knowledge that we need for a lifetime journey, but we have to start somewhere. So our lives are a continuum, and they're part of another larger continuum. That's what we're here to talk about today in part 2 of our discussion on story in the context of culture. So story isn't something isolated. It's not just a communication form. It's something that reflects a deeper part of our lives. Our lives are stories. And when you look at the word history places us squarely in another story, his story. So what a shock it is when you come, if you're on a faith journey that leads you through the Christian journey with Jesus. One of the first lessons you have to learn is there is a God, and you are not him. And that comes as quite a shock for many of us. Somehow, it wouldn't seem like it. But to the extent that we believe we are the centers of our own universe, that things all revolve around our needs, wants, and desires, and that there are, in fact, artifacts being constructed that appeal to that. Advertising often reflects that. So we're on a journey. We have a story. We're part of a story. We're telling someone else's story even as we shape our own story. And you could ask, as Jenny Conkin spoke in this video clip and others have said, what is your principal purpose? What have you really got to prove? Because story invokes tension. Without tension, without opposition, without conflict, even without suffering, there's no real story. So I'm trying to locate our stories individually in a larger context, in a cultural context. Culture is derived from our values. Those values are worked out over time. We're really in a set period of time where there's a set of competing values, isn't there? We're in a world of competing values. So if you don't know where your values are, if you were to create a set of concentric circles, at the center of that is you and your values, the things that shape you. Where do you get your values? Well, you probably get them first and foremost from the environment you grow up in, your family, or whatever approximates your family. You may have grown up in an institutional environment. I've worked with and become close friends with people who have been abandoned by their natural biological families. That's a pretty hard place to start life, isn't it? So if you're starting out life with an uncertainty that you have value because whatever that family locus or construct that would have given you the nurture for your nature, whatever that reflects in your personality, that's absent. So in a sense, you're wondering what kind of values or what lack of values would place you in an institutional setting of an orphanage, abandonment. There are good places. You can be loved in an orphanage. You might be better off in some orphanages than you would be in other disruptive, dysfunctional, violent family contexts. But this is where we get our ideas. What shaped you? What are your values? Do you know what your values are? In some senses, we're still working that out. We're still working out the things that shape our values, that shape our lives. Could you write down your values now? Could you write down the things and make a list to open up your notebooks? We've really emphasized the importance of taking notes and reflecting on where we are in our journeys and our stories. If you were to take would it fill a page? Would it fill multiple pages? What would your values look like? Number 2, where do your values come from? Number 3, How are your values applied in your life? So with that in mind, I want to extend the idea that there is a collective context for our values that reflects our culture. What is culture? When Dave talked about his visit with Cheryl to New York City, he had the pleasure and the privilege of showing them around. And one of the places I like to go and take people is, in fact, Lincoln Center, because there is, in a sense there, a kind of contemporary temple of culture. And if you've been to Lincoln Center, you know there's a fountain in the middle, and in the forecourt, at the back, is the Metropolitan Opera. Now, it's interesting that if you go to the great European cities, and you'll notice that one of the principal buildings in those cities that occupies a position of great recognition and architectural distinction is often the opera. Alongside that, at Lincoln Center, is the ballet on the left and the symphony, the buildings that house those two expressions of movement and music. Now, it's interesting, isn't it, that when we were talking about the power of story, emphasizing story, our culture is telling us a story or stories all the time. And it's using the senses. What does dance? And I've met, actually when I've been here before, I've met professional dancers. And the discipline and the rigor and the focus and the sacrifice that's required to become an excellent dancer requires really understanding how that form alone, the human movement alone, expresses so much. I had the great privilege and opportunity to be involved with and even on the board of the Jose Limon Dance Company at one time. Now the oldest dance company in America after Martha Graham. And Jose Limon had a fascinating series. He was awarded posthumously the National Medal for the Arts a few years ago. But Limon saw in dance our humanity. He saw things that were expressed through dance that were the best expression of things that are... Now that was a kind of mental dance. I didn't know this was miking the inside of my cranium. It didn't feel as conflicted as it sounded. But I'm trying to use all my senses to express a point. Thank you for that. Can you still hear me? Or just the inside of my cranium? Dance is important because it allows us to see in movement something that's essentially human, essentially transcendent, essentially beautiful. And if we see it that way, and then you notice on the right-hand side of the forecourt I was describing at Lincoln Center, you have the symphony. So in classical music, in music that's been carried down, all kinds of music could be performed in these concert halls. But what is it about certain kinds of music that have withstood the test of time? I had a college student tell me recently that he felt that long after Johann Sebastian Bach was forgotten, that P. Diddy would in fact withstand the test of time. Now, maybe that's true, but it'd be very interesting to think of these concert halls being devoted to a different kind of cultural estimation of the things that are important. But that's what culture does for us. Culture tells us something about what we collectively support and enhance. I had dinner with the chairman of the Metropolitan Opera, and I was quite surprised to learn that it costs them over $250 million a year to sustain the opera. Now that's quite a commitment to the arts, and that's considered one of the highest expressions of opera, at least in the U.S., and so the set designs. And if you've been there, it's really quite something when they perform Aida, for example, and they have elephants on stage, or they do things that are really quite spectacular. Why? Why is that so essential? Why couldn't you just go and see it on a telescreen somewhere? Because there's something about being in the moment. There's something about the grandeur. There's something really even about the commitment to detail. The costumes wouldn't have to be as elaborate. If you're sitting 75 rows away, you may not notice the level of detail and excellence that goes into every dimension of the presentation of an idea. But in the opera, the thing that interests me most about this in the cultural setting and the storytelling is that we see around the world the importance of story, The opera represents an essential story form. Now, you may or may not have been privileged to be exposed to the opera. You may or may not be an opera fan. But what you'll see in opera, and the way opera is presented, is how the consistency of excellence with which the operas, which have come down to us for a couple of centuries, are presented. And there's an eye and an ear for detail, even in the hearer, even in audiences that will see opera after opera after opera, and they're looking for what each tenor or soprano or costume designer or lighting designer or musician brings to the presentation. Why is that important? Because there's a level of excellence and authenticity to presenting something that's deemed to be transcendently human. Opera depicts all of us in some way. And so you can get to the point where, as an opera fan, you could estimate its value as being higher than other things. But in my mind, the highest story value we carry with us is our ability to portray the story of another kind of transcendence. And so I want to say again that you may be here today and you may not be sharing the Christian journey. You may not be someone who's familiar with the life and teachings of Jesus, who have, for many of us, or most of us, gathered at this conference, been arrested by his life and teaching. Arrested, changed, transformed. We look at our life stories as being before our encounter with a living Christ or after. We look at our lives before Jesus, before Christ, and Anno Domini, in the year of our experience of the Lord. Our Gregorian calendar is a reflection of that. All of history is a reflection. Now, there's a secular effort, of course, to erase that and just call it the common era. But there's something sacred. If there is something sacred at all about life, then there's something sacred about time. So what is it that's sacred about you spending time here today and trying to get a better grasp of your story? Well, it's the same kind of devotion you might have to an art form, or to improving your golf game, or to any number of things where you simply have a limited amount of time. You want to experience the greatest amount of enjoyment or optimize the possibilities of what can come from that experience. Well, how much more life and how much more storytelling in our lives. I just encountered my friend Hal, who lost his precious wife, and for him, Hal's story is defined really before and after the experience he had of his wife's impact on him. He believes even to this day that much of what's happening in his life is conspiratorial between his now departed wife and her creator. And he has a wonderful sense of love and longing, and it's powerful. It's touching. He lives that story. He lives a story of love lost, but love that's still alive in his heart and his life. You see that. Are you in love today? Or are you more in fear than love? What is the calculus behind your story? What's the force behind your story? What's the purpose and passion and privilege and point and proof of your story? So, culture gives us a very, very specific context, individually and collectively, for looking at how powerfully we live our stories. It was said of the first century church, and thank you for those. First of all, I want to say I'm so glad that there are people here in this conference who are here joining us in questioning the journey with Jesus. Really wondering. It's a good thing. You shouldn't want to come to a faith that doesn't invite questions, that doesn't demand scrutiny. It doesn't require something. If you're going to give your life to Christ, you certainly want to examine the truth claims surrounding that life. And the Christian faith is not one that fears scrutiny or questioning. There's a kind of contemporary, fashionable atheism today that suggests that religion is so mythological that it's really pathological. And what we're doing is comforting ourselves with fantasies and fairy tales because we can't handle the truth. Well, if the truth is you're nothing but a consequence, I say this repeatedly because I'm driving a point home in the larger cultural narrative that we're all exposed to. If your life is nothing but time plus chance plus matter, and you're an accident, and the consequences of your actions and choices and decisions and values are nothing more than an arbitrary consignment of what it is you feel at the moment, and there is no truth and no transcendence, then what is the point of your story anyway? It's all very, very temporal. It's all an exercise ultimately in existential futility. And if you look at Albert Camus, and you look at the stranger, you look at the plague, and you look at the doctor in the plague who in the book is faced with the opportunity to leave the plague-ridden city and escape it or stay there and lose his life, and is asked to give an explanation, and he can't, but he's on the verge of it, saying because he knows there's some reason he can't fully and clearly identify it. But he senses something. There is some rationale for my life. There's some purpose and meaning and larger beauty than what I'm seeing or than what I might be able to explain. It is therefore our responsibility, if you're a person on the faith journey that I'm describing, to be an articulate storyteller. Story is everything to us. We've inherited a story, not a fantasy, not a fairy tale, not a myth, but something that is so extraordinary in its nature and proportions and implications that it competes with myth. It competes with the largest cosmological attempts to explain life itself. What is life? What is your life? And you're surrounded by people. Having spent most of my career in advertising, I can tell you that we make a science out of distraction. Phil had talked about this as one of the other concurrent themes of this conference. We make a study of giving you the things that appeal to your needs, wants, and desires on a generally superficial level. Do you really think that anything material is going to satisfy your deepest need to understand what your life was all about? We die alone. But too often we live alone as well. And we weren't meant to do either. Although we will face the consequences of our choices, our values, you could say that most people use a fairly loose and relative comparison of their performance with other people. Say, well, I'm better than that person. Do you deserve heaven? Do you deserve eternity? Do you deserve the kind of position before Almighty God that absolves you of all wrongdoing, even wrong thoughts and motives, which Jesus, the only sinless person, the only person to have even claimed sinlessness? Wouldn't you think, even if you purpose to be a secular atheist today, you would want to closely investigate the claims of someone who said he was sinless and perfect? And there could be, amongst his contemporaries, found no fault in him except that his claims competed with the religious establishment of the time. Would you not think that that's something that's worth your time and effort and energy? So becoming better at storytelling, becoming masters at telling our own story, becoming better acquainted with the story of all stories, the greatest story ever told. And it's a matchless comparison. There is no other religious or political or cultural or creative figure in the history of the world who's made the kind of truth claims that Jesus of Nazareth made. That in itself begs scrutiny, begs understanding, begs going deeper and understanding what that story is about for us. So, how many times have you told your story? Where are you in that story? Where are you in that story continuum? I might even have a slide today. Just one. But it says it all in a way. We're living somewhere in this margin, at least I am. That might be an optimistic goal, 2040. But if you look at recorded human history or what we know or speculate further about to the left side of the continuum and what eternity looks like to the right end, we're here for a very short time. And I would submit to you that if you are alone in this life without explanation, without cause or purpose, you may as well eat, drink, and be merry and keep yourself inoculated from the reality that you are very, very, very much alone. But the world keeps itself busy and distracted because we don't want to contemplate the consequences of being totally alone. So if we're here to give people an explanation for what Dave has described to me, an explanation he uses with a long rope, and that the very end of it is a small strand of tape, red tape on it, to suggest that this is the span of our lives, and we are preoccupied with it, not thinking how long that strand could be. There's no strand that would be long enough. You could put 1 inch of tape on the end, that's your lifespan, and you could stretch that rope all the way through this building and all the way around this planet. It still wouldn't be enough to express what that looks like. So here's the stone-cold, hard reality of our circumstances as I understand it. And see if this doesn't make sense to you. That we are, in fact, given this extraordinary gift of life in the context of a culture that's a kind of a classroom. And it's a moral and spiritual vacuum in which we must make decisions based on the evidence, based on the experiences, based on the details and ideas that are presented to us. And because we're all different, we're all going to get different clues. So instead of life being a blunt force instrument, it's actually a kind of fascinating mystery. And isn't it interesting that the Creator, who could certainly reveal himself in a variety of ways, including putting some spectacle of light in front of us that would be unimaginably powerful, and could make a statement that would be hard to resist or deny, but instead whispers to us more often than shouts. C.S. Lewis said, he whispers in our pleasure, but he shouts through our pain. And who goes through life without some kind of struggle, some kind of opposition, some kind of pain, some kind of challenge? We all do. Because we're in a beautiful but broken world. So if this is what storytelling is all about, if this is what our journey is all about, and we have this very narrow space of time, what a wonder. And here's the good news, that because of our moral culpability, because God has created us with free will, a gift in itself, and we can choose to love and be loved, or we can choose to go our own way, we're in this most unique and really privileged planet of circumstances with 22 immutable laws under which this planet exists, were any one of those laws to be altered or changed by a degree, even the trajectory of our planet, we would freeze or fry. Look, it's hard to get our eyes around. We spend more time thinking about what we're going to wear than thinking about our real condition on this larger journey. Do we not? So knowing that, think about the consciousness component of the Christian journey, and there's very little adequate teaching on this subject. We're given lots of data points. We're given a kind of curricula to memorize and study. It's meant to liberate us by truth. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall what? Set you free from what? How many people feel really free here today? And free of what? Free of what? Fear. What else are we set free from? Self, the prison of self. And what does self tell us? How does self afflict or obscure our story? Lots of thoughts go on. This would be the point where that sound effect should come into play. Why? Because we're really, really self-absorbed, not because we really feel confident and superior. We're self-absorbed because we are deathly afraid that something bigger, more irresistible, more incomprehensible, more powerful, more compelling, more demanding than we could ever imagine, truth itself, the Creator himself, who has revealed himself, that we might come home, finally home. So what does it look like to find that home? That was the other piece that stood out in what Jenny Conkin's piece suggested to me. When we're on this journey, what is it that we really long for? Ultimately, we want a place that we can call home. How much time and effort and imagination and architectural design, Michael, and fascination goes into creating a domicile today? Well, a lot. If you're fortunate enough to be someone who can have an architect design space to reside in, what an extraordinary thing. And the world today is in the biggest luxury high-rise building, I don't know what you would call it. I've just read something in the last week that called it the new Gilded Age, because the spectacular nature of the amount of building projects are up 72% in Manhattan alone to support 11% increase in private residences. 74% of what's being spent, in other words, in one of the highest priced markets in North America, is to support only 11% of the housing market. It means that there is a spectacular level of luxury while people are struggling and suffering. Now, I'm not making judgments how people derive at their resources, but there's another corollary to that that's also interesting when it comes to story and disclosure, and that is that many of the people who are buying luxury homes right now are obscuring the details of their identity. They're coming from other countries with flight capital. It's happening in Vancouver, it's happening in Toronto, it's happening in major cities around the world. It's fear-based capital. And what will happen to that? Listen, if you're on the journey with Jesus, you know that this world is not your home. You'll never be totally satisfied here. We were never made to be completely content in this world. We were made for another world. And you'll only be ultimately satisfied and most deeply fulfilled when you know that what you're doing here today and now is preparing you to go home. But there's another facet and feature of this that's critical to our stories, and that is that the one who's prepared a place for us, the one who's prepared a place for us has asked us to do at least one thing: invite others to come home too. Is that such an awful burden? Or are we so deceived personally that we do not know how to get past ourselves and be more concerned about other people? So when it comes to your story, the Christian tradition has it that you have a testimony, because there's a kind of legal operation that goes on with your story. Yeah? The legal operation is you move from darkness to light. You move from condemnation to absolution and freedom and redemption, because somebody else has paid this terrible price for sin, which is our individual and collective rebellion. I don't even know if we use that word very much in society anymore, except as a kind of joke. There's a sin tax. I've heard that used. But what is the nature of something that would separate you from your Creator and put into question and doubt where you're going to spend eternity? Where will you spend eternity? And that confidence is rooted in faith. And that faith is rooted in reason. That reason is rooted in truth. So how you tell your story and how you share your testimony has a lot to do with the condition people will have for the rest of their lives and for eternity. When we're at a story conference like this, part of the reason we want to get our stories right, and part of the reason you're going to have a session following mine with Jim Kruger that's going to be fantastic. Jim's going to allow people who do not feel you have a powerful story to gain empowerment for telling your story. This is really practical stuff. Because if you're not an interesting person, or you may be interesting for the wrong reasons, you're not going to win the attention or interest of other people. And if you're on a journey with a mandate, we have a great commission, which is all authority in heaven and on earth have been given to whom? Jesus Christ of Nazareth, who appearing before his disciples after his resurrection and before his ascension says, "Go therefore and teach the nations and disciple them." So part of our story is to teach people and to bring them home. So here's the practical landing point for this. How many people have you told your story to today? How many people did you tell yesterday or the day before? There are songs and hymns that remind us that this is such spectacular news that it was trumpeted by angels. It's go tell it on the mountain, shout it from the housetops. We have become blasé about the thing that we should be the least blasé about. People really are, and frankly, I do not believe we believe that people, in fact, are going to face an eternity without Christ. And I believe until individually and collectively, as the ecclesia, the people who are called the body of Christ, who are riding through this life in an ark-like setting, I've used that metaphor here below. When you think of coming into the kirka, the church, which comes from ecclesia, we're called out of the din of this world so that we can be in a setting like this to hear something that has transcendence to it, or purports to have transcendence. Is that what you're going to hear at the Burberry shop, or any number of clothing stores, which are really, it's just the fine raiment and attire of our own conceit? I'm not saying you can't be fashionable. I'm just saying people are utterly preoccupied at times with their outward appearance while their inward condition is wasting away. That's the reality. And if we don't hear teaching and we don't hear more comment like this, I fear that we really will take for granted the idea that people sitting right next to you may in fact be facing an eternity without redemption, without hope, without the reality that Christ, who died on the cross for our sins, shed his blood, which was part of the requirement, the actual eternal, consequential, cosmological, legal transaction that had to take place. His life for ours, his shed blood for ours. If that doesn't become real to us, then really it does not even matter how good your storytelling skills are. You have to be able to get to that story. And that story is your testimony of change. And for me, it was a change that's been, radicalized in terms of setting me free from my own selfishness, my own contempt for myself, the guilt and stain and shame of fear, having grown up in the Episcopal tradition, heard the gospel, got married at 22, divorced at 29, blamed myself for a failed marriage, which is something I didn't want, went to New York City, convinced myself that I had to make a name for myself or do something that would at least create an exterior barrier or some patina of happiness or success or contentment that I could live behind while I was dying inside, and had fascinating experiences in fascinating places with fascinating people. And what I saw as a result of the sum total of all those experiences was that people are miserable without the love of Jesus. I can say that from having been literally with the wealthiest person in the world at the time, in the home of Adnan Khashoggi. I've been with multiple billionaires. I've been people in the top 10, top 50, top 100, top 400, whatever listing you want. And I've been on the jet aircraft and the mega yachts and palaces and homes and estancias and I can tell you that everybody's the same everywhere. They have the same fears, the same needs, wants, and desires. The one thing that's missing that money can't buy is the love of God in Christ and the hope of God the gospel gives us to live in freedom. And if we don't value that, we don't think this is something worth jumping up and down about, having conferences about, reflecting about individually and collectively, if we don't feel this is the most important part of our life's journey and lessons, then we'll miss, nothing else matters. It literally comes down to, you could fail in a lot of areas in life, but if you fail to share the love that you've experienced in Christ with others. And I can't tell you that we will all do it exactly the same way because our personalities are so different. Thank God. But we complement each other. When we do it in the kirka, the ecclesia, remember the ecclesia, we're called out of this world into places like this for moments like this to look at something bigger than ourselves, someone bigger than ourselves, because that actually sets us free from ourselves. It's an awful thing to carry the burden of a dead carcass on your back called me. How much better to be alleviated from that suffering and to walk in freedom with the resurrected Christ. I'm so excited about that I think sometimes that my thought process gets ahead of where my heart is, which is just to sing and dance and rejoice and be childlike in the recovered innocence of that great story. And when minds like that of C.S. Lewis and other former atheists, by the way, who were contentious with the faith and then came into the faith, if you haven't discovered the life and work of C.S. Lewis, they're in one soul, in one writer, in one mind, a mind awake, is as much information, I think, for anyone who's literate and interested in life and a variety of forms of literature. You cannot help, in my estimation, but be deeply intrigued, satisfied, and really happy to discover somebody who had such a great literary output with such a generous talent for looking at himself in life. And how much more could we be sharing with people around us? Listen, when we started this, and when Dave and I talked about this years ago, we thought that the power of story is something that we need to master so that we can actually get out and create a more interesting way of connecting with people all around us in so many possibilities, in so many engagements, in so many processes, in so many places. But what are you doing with your story? We're going to wrap up today and tonight. This has just been a fantastic Istoria conference. But it all comes down to how everything you're experiencing can be translated to somebody for whom you are probably or possibly the sole link to life eternal. And if that isn't, listen, if we were back in the 19th century, there'd be someone shouting in a much larger auditorium possibly without the benefit of a microphone, but saying things over and over again that bear repeating, because this was the era of revivalists and people who had such an urgency and such a tendency to want to be clear about one thing above all, that we need God. We need redemption. We have it in Christ. What could be better, more fulfilling? What could be more? There isn't a place in this city today where you could hear a more timely or important message. And yet we're not sure. We're so, it's just what Phil said Wednesday night. We are distracted. We are fragmented. We can't even get our heads around that because so many things are going on around us all the time. But as Phil quoted St. Paul, this one thing I do, pressing on to that which lies ahead of us. Whatever shame or disfiguring circumstances have been in our past, isn't it great to know that Jesus has paid that price to set us free? And one day you will be in his presence. One day you will have that opportunity to give an account, to give a testimony, to tell your story. Not that he doesn't know it all already, but you'll be offering an explanation for what you did with what you were given. Every one of us, one by one, with our Creator. Isn't this the one thing we want to get right? And I'm reminded in wrapping up, I'm thinking of Romans 12:2. I'm thinking of Paul saying, do not be conformed to this world. The world has its own story, has its own narrative. But be transformed by the renewing of your minds. This is a mental discipline first and foremost. Be transformed by the renewing of your mind that you may what? What have you got? What did we say at the beginning of this talk? What have you got to prove? And here's where Paul says it, that you may prove what is the will of God on 3 levels. What is good? Well, we want to do good things. What is acceptable? Acceptable to who? Acceptable to God. And ultimately, what is perfect? Completed. And I submit to you that the one thing that is going to be perfect is allowing us to tell his story through our broken lives. It's a beautiful but broken world. And if you will believe God for this, he will take your brokenness, and because of that resolution of conflict was an essential story element. Our stories would be nearly as interesting if there weren't something that God couldn't improve or repair in us. That doesn't mean you have to go out and do something horrific so you have a better story by contrast. It does mean that there's so much more from where we are, often too satisfied, than where we could be if we're willing to embrace everything He has for us in our lives. I'm so glad you came to this conference. I'm so glad I'm here, because this is what it all comes down to. This is where the beginning and ending. Our story is somewhere in that continuum that you saw earlier. Our story is compacted this moment, this day, this hour, what you do from here, what you do this afternoon, what you do from every day here on out is a significant part of how well you're going to tell your story. And if we do that, then we'll know what is good, acceptable, and perfect. I'm so glad to be together for this Istoria conference, and